In the heart of the Roman Empire, where marble palaces gleamed beneath the Mediterranean sun and legions marched to the rhythm of conquest, there rose a man whose madness would stain the very name of Rome itself. He was not born in darkness, he was born into glory. Yet power, grief, and paranoia twisted him into something unrecognizable. His reign would become a symbol of how absolute authority, when placed in the wrong hands, can destroy both ruler and empire alike. This is the story of Gaius Caligula, the emperor whose descent into insanity turned Rome's golden age into a nightmare. When absolute power falls into the hands of a man consumed by madness, history trembles. Picture a ruler who turns executions into amusement, who dresses his horse in royal robes, and even plans to make it a senator. It sounds like a tale from legend, but for ancient Rome, it was terrifyingly real. His name was Caligula, and many believe he was the most dangerous man ever to sit upon the imperial throne. In just 4 years, his reign carved a scar so deep into Roman memory that nearly 2,000 years later, his name still echoes through history books. This is the story of Caligula, the cruelest emperor Rome ever knew. Before the world came to despise him, Caligula was not the monster history remembers. He was born into greatness, into a family of heroes and legends. His early life was a strange blend of privilege, tragedy, and fear, a combination that many believe planted the seeds of the madness to come. He entered the world on August 31st, 12 AD, in the coastal town of Antium. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, and he came from one of the most powerful bloodlines Rome had ever known. His father, Germanicus, was the grandson of Mark Antony. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus himself. The Roman people adored the family and saw in young Caligula the promise of Rome's future. Germanicus was more than a general, he was a national hero. The legions worshipped him, and the public adored him. To them, he was the rightful successor to Emperor Tiberius. When Caligula was just a child, his mother dressed him in a miniature soldier's uniform and tiny boots called caligae. The soldiers found it adorable and gave him a nickname that would follow him forever, Caligula, meaning little boots. He marched proudly beside his father through Germania, waving to crowds, smiling at parades, and even addressing the troops at the age of 6. To Rome, he was the empire's beloved mascot. But the glory didn't last. In 19 AD, tragedy struck. During a campaign in the eastern provinces, Germanicus fell ill and died in Antioch. His wife Agrippina believed he had been poisoned, and many suspected Emperor Tiberius, himself jealous of Germanicus's popularity, had ordered the deed. Whether true or not, the death of his father shattered Caligula's childhood. He was only 7 years old when Germanicus's ashes returned to Rome. The funeral procession stretched through the city. Caligula, his mother, and his siblings walked behind the coffin, watched by a grieving nation. But from that moment on, their family's star began to fade. To the paranoid Emperor Tiberius, Agrippina and her sons became a threat. Agrippina's bold personality and ambition only deepened his suspicion. In 29 AD, Tiberius struck. Agrippina and Caligula's older brother Nero were arrested for treason, accused of plotting against the emperor. A ruthless officer of the Praetorian Guard named Sejanus ensured their downfall. They were exiled, and within a year, Caligula's other brother, Drusus, met the same fate. All three would die in captivity. Caligula's mother never returned. Now alone, he was sent to live with distant relatives, first with his great-grandmother Livia, then his grandmother Antonia. He was a lonely child surrounded by enemies, surviving in silence. By 31 AD, Caligula was summoned to the island of Capri, where the aging Tiberius had secluded himself. The emperor's retreat was infamous for its corruption and cruelty. There, in that gilded prison, Caligula learned how to survive. He laughed when Tiberius laughed, remained silent when others screamed, and watched carefully as the emperor's paranoia consumed those around him. He saw torture, executions, and betrayals. Some say this is where Caligula's mind began to fracture. Others believe it was where he learned that mercy had no place in power. He lived like a prince, but existed in constant fear, knowing what had become of his family, knowing that his every word was being measured. And through it all, he waited. When Tiberius's adopted son and Caligula's remaining brother, Drusus, died of starvation in captivity, the line of succession opened. Caligula suddenly stood in line for the throne alongside his cousin Gemellus. By 35 AD, Tiberius named both as joint heirs. But Caligula had something Gemellus didn't: the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. After the fall of Sejanus, the new commander, Macro, aligned himself with Caligula, quietly preparing for the old emperor's end. In March 37 AD, Tiberius died. Some claim Caligula smothered him in his sleep, though others insisted he simply passed of old age. Whatever the truth, Macro acted swiftly. The Praetorian Guard declared Caligula emperor, and the Senate confirmed it. At just 24 years old, Caligula had outlived his enemies and claimed the most powerful seat in the world. The people of Rome rejoiced. To them, the son of Germanicus had come to restore glory. They celebrated the end of Tiberius's paranoia, the beginning of hope. Caligula's first months as emperor were filled with generosity and spectacle. He abolished unpopular taxes, freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and repaired temples. He rewarded soldiers with bonuses and threw lavish games that transformed the city into a festival of color and sound. Gold flowed through Rome once more, and the Senate hailed him as a savior. For the first time in years, it seemed Rome had found a ruler who truly cared. But the light did not last. Just a few months after ascending to power, Emperor Caligula fell gravely ill. The sickness came suddenly, with violent fever and delirium that left him bedridden for weeks. When he finally recovered, Rome rejoiced, believing the young emperor had been saved by the gods. But the man who rose from that bed was not the same man who had first worn the imperial crown. Something inside him had changed. Perhaps the illness had scarred his mind, or perhaps it had unleashed something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Some whispered that he had been poisoned. Others believed his brain had been permanently damaged by the fever. Whatever the truth, the Caligula who returned to rule was no longer the promising, charismatic leader Rome had once celebrated. After his recovery, his behavior grew increasingly strange, erratic, and disturbing. He began to speak of himself not as a mortal man, but as a living god. Unlike previous emperors who paid homage to Rome's deities, Caligula claimed to be one. He dressed as Jupiter, the king of the gods, wearing robes of gold and holding thunderbolts as props. At banquets, he would pose beside statues of Jupiter and demand that guests tell him who looked more divine. Anyone who hesitated or answered incorrectly was beaten or executed. He even commissioned a temple dedicated entirely to himself, with a golden statue of his own likeness placed inside. Every morning, attendants dressed this statue in the same clothes Caligula wore that day. Wealthy Romans fought for the privilege to serve as priests in this new temple, offering rare animals like flamingos, peacocks, and pheasants as sacrifices to their living god. Caligula's temple was not located in a distant sanctuary, but directly connected to his palace, a clear symbol that religion and government were now one and the same, both centered entirely around him. He announced plans to bring the great statue of Zeus from Greece to Rome, so that he could replace its head with his own likeness. It was not enough to be worshipped. He wanted to replace the gods themselves. His delusions only deepened. Caligula began claiming that the moon goddess Selene had fallen in love with him, saying she visited him each night in his chambers. Guards reported seeing him standing on palace balconies late at night, talking to the sky, laughing and gesturing as if speaking to unseen beings. At times, he claimed the ocean whispered secrets to him when he couldn't sleep. Once, when a guard told him that only gods could see other gods, Caligula smiled and promoted the man to one of his closest advisors. But his divine fantasy soon turned dark. Caligula began issuing new laws, many of them bizarre, cruel, and senseless. He declared that no one was allowed to laugh near him. Laughter itself became a punishable crime. Anyone caught smiling or joking in his presence could be whipped or executed. After the death of his sister Drusilla, whom he loved deeply and perhaps even desired, Caligula ordered an empire-wide mourning period. For months, no one was allowed to bathe, host parties, or even eat with their families. Citizens were forced to grieve or risk death. Some historians later wrote that during this time, Rome itself seemed to fall into silence, a city afraid even to breathe. Caligula's insecurities became law. His body was covered in thick hair, and he began to lose his hair on top like many of his ancestors. Paranoid that people mocked his appearance, he banned anyone from mentioning goats in his presence, believing the comparison was aimed at him. He made it illegal for anyone to stand above him or look down upon him. When he passed through the streets, citizens had to bow their heads or step down from stairs to avoid appearing taller. He spent hours practicing fierce expressions in front of mirrors, ordering his guards and senators to mimic his face so that they would reflect his supposed divinity. Public humiliation became his new form of entertainment. Senators and nobles were forced to run beside his chariot like slaves. High-ranking men of Rome were made to fight in mock battles for the emperor's amusement. What had once been political power had now turned into personal domination. Caligula no longer sought to lead the empire. He sought to control it completely. Every decree, every execution, and every humiliation served one purpose: to remind Rome that he could do anything and that no one could stop him. Historians have long debated whether Caligula was truly insane or simply consumed by unchecked power. But to those living in Rome at the time, the answer hardly mattered. The emperor they had once adored had become a nightmare. He demanded worship, obedience, and silence. His rules defied logic. His punishments came without warning, and the city that had once celebrated him now lived in fear of the sound of his voice. His reign was no longer about governance or justice. It had become a theater of cruelty. As his madness deepened, so did his extravagance. Caligula bathed in water mixed with gold dust. He drank pearls dissolved in vinegar, believing it made him more godlike. He walked barefoot across carpets embroidered with jewels and slept on floors covered in coins. He ordered the construction of enormous floating palaces, ships adorned with marble columns, mosaics, heated baths, and fountains. At his banquets, guests dined on meals served in solid gold dishes, while musicians played endlessly and exotic birds with jeweled collars flew overhead. Every corner of his world glittered with excess, a reflection of his vanity and madness. But this luxury came at a devastating cost. Within his first year as emperor, Caligula had spent nearly 2.7 billion sestertii, completely draining the state treasury. He poured Rome's wealth into festivals, games, temples, and self-glorifying monuments. One of his most outrageous projects was a bridge made entirely of ships across the Bay of Bai, a structure stretching for miles, serving no purpose other than spectacle. Caligula rode across it on horseback, wearing the armor of Alexander the Great, declaring that he had conquered the sea itself. When the treasury finally ran dry, Caligula refused to slow his spending. Instead, he invented new taxes, strange, cruel, and humiliating ones. He taxed lawsuits, food brought into the city, wages, slaves, artisans, and even marriages. Prostitutes were forced to pay a tax whether they were still working or had retired. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to act as tax collectors, sending soldiers instead of officials. Citizens lived in terror of these visits, as the soldiers often took far more than what was owed, and anyone who complained risked death. Caligula's greed eventually turned to open theft. He accused wealthy citizens of treason or insult, executed them, and seized their property. He forged wills, altered inheritance documents, and declared that anyone who failed to leave him money in there was ungrateful to the emperor, a crime punishable by confiscation of all assets. Families who had served Rome for generations were destroyed overnight. Many preferred suicide to the public shame and ruin that came with imperial attention. Among his most infamous creations were the Nemean ships, two colossal floating palaces anchored on Lake Nemi. They were more than 200 feet long, complete with marble floors, heating systems, running water, banquet halls, and golden statues. Their sails were woven from colored silk, and their purpose was purely pleasure. Caligula used them for lavish feasts, orgies, and displays of wealth that defied imagination. The money for these floating monuments came from the suffering of the Roman people, from taxes, extortion, and stolen fortunes. He reshaped the land itself to satisfy his ego. Caligula ordered mountains to be tunneled through, hills flattened, and rivers diverted simply to prove that nature could bend to his will. Craftsmen were forced to tear down buildings and rebuild them for no reason other than his amusement. Engineers were commanded to design impossible machines, including buildings that could move just to feed his insatiable hunger for control. And through all of this madness, one being seemed to hold his true affection, his beloved horse, Incitatus. This magnificent white stallion, whose name meant swift, was housed in a marble stable, fed with oats mixed with gold flakes, and adorned with jewel harnesses. Caligula called him a friend, a companion, and even hinted that he would one day make him a consul of Rome. To the emperor, it was the ultimate joke, a mockery of the Senate and of the empire itself. To the people of Rome, it was proof that their god emperor had lost all reason. Caligula's reign over Rome remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of the empire, a tale where madness and power blended into something almost unrecognizable. Among the many stories that reveal his descent into tyranny, none is more infamous than the one about his horse, Incitatus. This horse was not treated as an animal, but as a royal companion, a living symbol of Caligula's warped sense of authority. The emperor spared no expense on him. Incitatus lived in a marble stable, tended by servants, and wore a collar made of glittering precious stones. His stall was lined with luxury, and he slept on purple blankets, the most expensive and sacred color in Rome, reserved only for emperors and gods. Caligula even built him a private house with its own slaves, furniture, and attendants devoted entirely to his comfort. Before important race days, the emperor ordered absolute silence throughout the neighborhood so that Incitatus could sleep undisturbed. Guards patrolled the streets, and citizens were warned not to make a sound. The entire district became a sanctuary for one horse, all because its master demanded it. Caligula's love for horse racing bordered on obsession. He believed that Incitatus was not only the finest racehorse in the empire, but also a companion worthy of divine treatment. His meals were extravagant, oats mixed with gold flakes, served in golden bowls, accompanied by the finest wines poured into jeweled cups. Caligula often invited him to banquets, placing dishes before the animal as though he were a distinguished guest. At times, he even spoke to him as a confidant or advisor, praising his intelligence above that of Rome's senators. When dignitaries visited the palace, Caligula would joke that they might soon receive an invitation to dine in Incitatus's house. Some accounts even suggest that he once claimed the horse understood politics better than the men who sat in the Senate chamber. Then came the moment that cemented Caligula's infamy forever. In a shocking declaration, he announced that Incitatus would be made consul of Rome. The position of consul was the highest political office in the Roman Republic and Empire, a role reserved for the most respected and capable statesmen. Consuls commanded armies, governed the state, and embodied the power and dignity of Roman leadership. Yet Caligula decided that this sacred office would belong to his horse. He told the Senate that Incitatus was more loyal, more intelligent, and more honorable than any of them. He claimed that the horse deserved to wear the consul's robe, sit upon the curule chair of state, and lead the Roman government alongside him. Ancient historian Suetonius recorded that Caligula gave formal orders to prepare Incitatus for his new political role. The horse was appointed as a priest and granted public ceremonies in his honor. Rumors spread that an oath ceremony for his consulship was being arranged. Senators were forced to applaud, bow, and pretend to celebrate, even as humiliation burned in their faces. None dared to object. Everyone knew what opposition meant: death. Caligula had made his point unmistakably clear. The Senate, once the proud governing body of the Roman world, had been reduced to a joke. By elevating a horse above them, Caligula sent a cruel message that their power, their traditions, and their voices meant nothing to him. He could replace them with an animal, and the empire would continue to function, proving that he alone controlled Rome. Historians today believe that this act was not simple madness, but a calculated insult. Caligula humiliated the Senate to remind them and the people that he stood above all law and order. It was a political statement of dominance disguised as insanity. Whether Incitatus ever truly became consul remains uncertain, but that was never the point. The preparations alone were enough to reveal Caligula's contempt for the old Roman values. While his horse received palaces, priests, and servants, citizens were executed without trial, land was seized from generals, and nobles were stripped of wealth. Caligula's Rome became a theater of absurdity, where fear and mockery replaced justice and reason. Whispers began to spread through the streets and markets of Rome. Citizens no longer spoke openly about the emperor. They whispered his name behind closed doors, wondering if he had gone mad, or if he was playing some cruel, unfathomable game. Some believed that the elevation of Incitatus symbolized more than madness. It marked the death of the Republic's last illusion of dignity. It was the moment Rome surrendered fully to tyranny. Power was no longer balanced by law or tradition. It was shaped only by one man's will. Caligula had proved that he could do whatever he pleased, and no one, not even the most powerful men in Rome, could stop him. But what came next revealed that his cruelty was far darker than anyone had imagined. Caligula often reminded his subjects publicly and privately that he held the power of life and death over them all. He made a habit of boasting that he could execute anyone, at any time, for any reason. This was not mere rhetoric. It was a philosophy of terror. To Caligula, the power to kill without justification was the ultimate expression of authority. Those closest to him lived in constant fear, never knowing whether a smile, a word, or even a glance might seal their fate. His famous saying, "Let them hate me so long as they fear me," became the defining principle of his rule. Love, he believed, was fickle and weak. Fear, on the other hand, was absolute. And so, Caligula ruled through fear alone. He executed senators for trivial reasons. One man was killed simply because his hairstyle was more elegant than the emperor's. Another died because he smiled too much in Caligula's presence. Others were punished for jokes, or because they appeared too cheerful in a time when the emperor felt melancholy. The smallest offense or no offense at all could end a life. The emperor even turned execution into entertainment. Ancient sources describe how Caligula would order deaths during banquets, forcing guests to continue eating while screams filled the hall. Blood would spill across marble floors, staining the golden cups and plates. Caligula would recline, sip his wine, and smile. Once, he invited a man whose son had been executed earlier that day to dine with him, saying nothing throughout the meal, merely watching the father's trembling hands. He enjoyed the sight of human suffering, claiming that pain sharpened the appetite and made food taste better. The gladiator arena also became a playground for his cruelty. Caligula sent nobles, senators, and officials into the arena to fight like slaves. Many had never held a sword before. Their deaths were quick and pathetic, designed only to amuse the emperor. When spectators once booed a performance, Caligula ordered the entire section of the audience to be executed. Hundreds of citizens were dragged away and slaughtered for expressing displeasure. He also made the crowd suffer, commanding that the awnings of the amphitheater be retracted during the hottest hours of the day, forcing everyone to sit under the burning sun until they fainted. For Caligula, these acts weren't senseless, they were reminders. He wanted every Roman to know that their lives, comfort, and dignity existed solely at his whim. But even absolute terror has limits. The fear that kept Rome silent began to turn inward, infecting those who served closest to him. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite protectors, grew tired of his unpredictability and brutality. They realized that even they were not safe. In the year 41 AD, after just 4 years on the throne, Caligula, the man who claimed to be a living god, was stabbed to death in a dark corridor of his palace by his own guards. His body fell to the ground, and with it, the illusion of divine power he had built around himself. Some historians argue that Caligula's cruelty was rooted in childhood trauma, others that it was the inevitable decay of a man who wielded unchecked power. But in the end, none of that absolves what he became. The emperor who once promised to continue the glory of Rome instead turned it into a nightmare. His name would forever be remembered not as a conqueror, not as a visionary, but as the embodiment of corruption, madness, and cruelty without end. Caligula's legacy endures as a warning, a reminder of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a man who has lost his humanity.